Hello, everyone. Very glad to have all the people that signed up today, and welcome to our ninth in a series of ICSVE Zoom conferences or panel discussions discussing various issues of terrorism and violent extremism. And we're excited to have so many people from around the world, again, a global village, which is an unexpected and wonderful thing about COVID, that when we're all on Zoom, we can meet from all over the world. And today we have people from the United States, European countries, including Estonia. And we have Abdul Haq Baker from United Arab Emirates today, but we also have others from the UAE, Lebanon, Russia, Brazil, many from the Maldives today, welcome, and Djibouti. That's just to name some of the countries that of the 144 that signed up today. And it's good to see many friends and colleagues among you. Welcome. And in our last event, we had Peta Lowe and Shane Healy, who discussed their prevention and intervention work in Australia, which was quite interesting. And if you missed that event or any of the 8 previous Zoom events, looking at issues of terrorism prevention, treatment, rehabilitation, and reintegration, you can still watch the recordings because we record all of these events, so please be aware you are being recorded. And they're posted on our ICSVE website under events, and we'll show those links in chat, so you can see them in chat. And don't worry about capturing anything from chat because we'll send it around to you later today. Or if we don't accomplish it today, tomorrow, because Molly has a test this afternoon. She's getting her PhD. Likewise, you can always view our 200 short counter-narrative videos, which feature ISIS and Al-Shabaab insiders denouncing terrorist groups. They're all on our ICSVE YouTube channel. And they're posted in, well, we try to keep up in 27 different languages. And but there's 201 of them made in English at this point. And today we are talking with a good friend of many, many years and a highly experienced practitioner, Abdul Haq Baker, and he's going to be looking at community-focused interventions against terrorism. We're also planning our next events, and we're always glad to hear from you about what you'd like to learn about and discuss in coming weeks. So we welcome your suggestions. You can put them in chat, or you can email us directly. And I hope that we'll hear from many of you in the question and answer section. We like this to be a discussion, and that's why we don't run webinars. We run them as Zoom meetings so that you can be involved. So you can chat during the conference, and many people do. We do ask that you remain polite and do not insult anybody else's religion or ethnicity. And we have had that happen in the past, unfortunately, and we have learned how to boot people out of the conference. So anybody who's inappropriate, here's your warning. If you insult anybody else in that way, you will be booted immediately and not welcomed back. We're proud to have this global village, and I think it's an opportunity to really value and celebrate our differences, as well as come together in our common goals to fight terrorism. And we will capture all the chat and briefly answer any questions posed in the chat, the ones that we're able to answer after the event, and we'll mail it around. So you'll have all of that later, as well as a recording of the event. So you're welcome to send that link to your colleagues if you want to, or if you didn't manage to come and you signed up, you can always watch it later. And I always like to thank our sponsors, past and present, which are the US State Department, the European Union, UN Women, Facebook, private donors, and the state of Qatar. And we're really grateful to each of our sponsors for helping us in different ways to get this far. We're particularly grateful to the state of Qatar for supporting our Breaking the ISIS Brand counter-narrative project. We've now been able to make 247 in-depth video interviews of ISIS defectors, cadres, and returnees and prisoners. And from these 247 ISIS interviews and another 16 of Al-Shabaab, we've created 201 short video clips of them denouncing ISIS, which we hope can be used for prevention and intervention. And Zach Badorf, who's hiding behind the ICSVE seal, makes most of those videos, and he's quite a talented video editor. Sheikh Ali also works on these, and I put in my 2 cents here and there. And we do try to subtitle them in the 27 languages that ISIS recruits in. So since we are a global village, if any of you want the videos in your language, we would just ask if you would help us to translate the short script of the video into your language, and we will produce them in your language. And anybody that's willing to help with those translation efforts, it's all volunteer, and we really appreciate it when people volunteer to do that. Also, I would say we're very grateful to Facebook, as they've allowed us to carry out over 150 Facebook and now Instagram campaigns as well. These are all run by Molly Ellenberg, and they're run to disrupt ISIS's online and face-to-face recruiting. And we found with Mona Thacker, who's getting into the Telegram groups and the Facebook groups, and Unreal Still ISIS presence on Instagram, and Molly has too, that these groups are still really active, even on the mainline platforms. So it's important that we talk against them. So in reference to today's presentation, back in the day when I was going through the UK, trying to learn about how people get on the terrorist trajectory, because I during my career made about 700 interviews of terrorists and people that were extremists. And I went through the UK and asked to be introduced to people that had been in it or were still in it. And I was also at that time working on the detainee rehabilitation program, which was going to be applied to 23,000 detainees and 800 juveniles. I learned some interesting things. And one was that Abdul Haq Baker, even back then, was fighting against, so this way before ISIS, was fighting and had started his street program. So he was working with a very committed group, and very knowledgeable group, and very loving group of imams and workers who were pulling kids out of violent extremism and terrorism. They were pulling them out from the streets and also from the prisons. And at that time, as I saw it, their focus was very ideological. And I became convinced that Salafis who really understand their religion might be best positioned to stand up against and stop those who were selling the Al-Qaeda, and now today we have the ISIS brand, of what some people like to label Salafi jihadism. I always didn't like that label, particularly after I worked with this group of people, because most Salafis would say it's a total misconstrual of their actual religious beliefs. And I became convinced that those people that religiously and ideologically could be seen as the closest to what some people call Salafi jihad, might be best positioned to argue ideologically. And I began to see evidence of this. But I also saw that it wasn't just ideology that was pulling people into these groups. For instance, I had one interview with a really poor kid from a gang neighborhood from the projects, and he told me he wanted to get I think you call it a plate in the UK, is that right, Abdul Haq? Yeah, he wanted a life plate, and he said he just wanted to end in prison for the rest of his life. His mother was already in prison, he wasn't well cared for, and he just wanted to have a guaranteed shelter and 3 meals a day. And he would have fallen in with anybody that would have taken care of him. And I also remember talking to a Kashmiri descent immigrant who told me he wanted to fight, he did fight jihad in Kashmir, but he wanted to go back to fight jihad anywhere because he wanted to die as a martyr. And he told me that he had sins that he didn't believe that God would forgive unless he died in that manner. He never told me what the sins were. They were too shameful to him, but that was his belief system. But then I ran into a Shia community worker who had pulled 17 street kids out of Al-Qaeda camps that were being run in the UK, in the forest, where they were taken to be convinced that they should continue their life of crime, but now in the name of Allah, and with the assurance from these leaders that they were pillaging from the kuffar, and that they should help fund Al-Qaeda, and that as long as they did that, their leaders were telling them, you're probably going to have a short life as a criminal, but at least you'll land in paradise at the end of it. And the girls were convinced that they should join because they were convincing the boys that the sisters can't be raped. So this was their protection to become Muslim. And in this regard, I want to plug a future event that's coming up for Abdul Haq. It's called Believe and Belong. And I told him I wanted that as our title because it's such a good title. And that's coming up at the end of October. So you can hear Abdul Haq talk again. But anyway, I don't want to take too much time. I just wanted to say that when I was looking at it, I found that these issues are very multifactorial and they need smart people working on them who understand both the societal and the ideological components, because these aren't either or. And a lot of people are suffering in society. I mean, I'm sorry to say, but when we're white middle class, sometimes we have no idea what kids in poor neighborhoods are facing every day and what they're facing from their society that shuts them out, that's violent to them. And they need to be approached in a holistic and a loving way. And Abdul Haq is one of those people. He's been around the block and around the block numerous times, in fact. So he's going to be speaking about community-targeted versus community-focused collaborations with government and how the former effectively perpetrates a top-down securitized focus on communities. And just to say a few words about Abdul Haq, he's the founder and manager. He's a 2009 award-winning manager of the youth initiative, which goes by the acronym of STREET, Strategy to Reach, Empower, and Educate Teenagers in the UK. He's a former lecturer, and I should say this is a guy that was learning on the street, doing all of this work, and had already learned his religion on a very high level, but then went back to get his PhD. So learning in all different aspects. So he's a former lecturer in terrorism studies at the Center of Studies in Terrorism and Political Violence at the University of St. Andrews, and is a research fellow at Exeter European Muslim Research Center. He was also the chairman of Brixton Mosque, and I'm not going to go too much into that because he can tell you himself about those adventures. So the floor is yours, Abdul Haq Baker, and we are so pleased and honored to have you speak with us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, for a very warm introduction. I really do appreciate that. And I was pleased to hear you highlight how we met and the collaborative effort and the very impressive work that you continue to do with your team. And I think I'd like to give a context to our participants regarding aspects of what Anne had said. So for example, the L plate, as Anne, I'm glad that she actually remembered that. We had individuals from an urban background, from a street culture, whose lives out of prison were so harsh, so unforgiving, that they preferred to be in prison, where they got, as Anne highlighted, hot meals, a bed at night, and they were able to share in some camaraderie where they would be safe. They were not at risk of being killed because of the gang and gun culture and knife crime that was prevalent in their society. Now, also referring to what Anne introduced at that particular point, many of us who lived that type of lifestyle needed somewhere to gravitate towards. And upon converting to Islam, we were very vulnerable, were very susceptible to whatever message was being imbued and imparted by those teaching us the religion. Many of us gravitated to Brixton Mosque, which was the first convert-led mosque in London, if not the UK, in 20th century Britain. And I was one such convert. In 1990, I embraced Islam. And before going into my life as a Muslim, what was the background that I had come from? In some respects, it wasn't as harsh as some of co-religionists that I'd met, but there was that systemic racism, structural racism that we'd faced. There was that police harassment and being arrested and thrown in cells and assaulted by police. This was a regular part of our lives, especially mine since the age of 13. And I hasten to add at this particular point, some may say, as is the common narrative and stereotype concerning young black men, that, well, you must have invited it, you must have moved in those circles, you must have been part of the criminal element. I was a young black man growing up like many, no criminal record, even until today. But just on account of being a young black man, South Londoner, and the type of environment and climate we were growing up in, we were easy pickings for some police, not all, but some who wanted to earn stripes, some who wanted to enact whatever prejudices they had held prior to joining the police force or since becoming police officers. And so it was a case of feeling hunted, literally feeling hunted, leaving your home, you hear sirens, you tense up. You're driving your car, you may start acting differently, which then attracts the attention of the police because your adrenaline's running so high, because you're going to be stopped. There was the risk of violence, being beaten, being taken to police cells, being beaten and then released without charge. And those of us who had no power within the system had no recourse to complain and highlight the police brutality that we were facing. So moving to conversion, and that wasn't the reason I converted. My life wasn't that terrible. I was working in the legal profession at the particular time, and I felt that that was a way to redress the imbalance that I had faced, and for others who had faced what I had faced. So I entered Islam, I embraced Islam, being a trainee lawyer, had bought my second home, was with my young wife, my newborn child. Things were going pretty well, following some pretty horrific and harrowing experiences as a young black non-Muslim and professional. Now, Brixton Mosque, for those who are unaware of Brixton Mosque, if I refer to Finsbury Park Mosque, where the infamous Finsbury Park Mosque, where Abu Hamza al-Misri had taken over and assumed control, and a lot of extremist goings on were taking place there. Many were radicalized in that particular mosque. When I say many, I say of the minority that became extreme, because overwhelmingly Muslims are resilient to the extremist narrative. Brixton was at the other end of the Finsbury Park, of the line, the Victoria line, should I say, on the underground. So we were in the south, Finsbury Park was in the north. But this was a mosque, Brixton Mosque was a mosque that attracted a lot of attention from extremist propagandists like Abdullah al-Faisal, like Abu Hamza, like Abu Qatada, like Omar Bakri. Why? Because it was a convert cohort, a convert community. And they found that the susceptibility of such converts to extremism was one that they wanted to tap into. However, they met their match, because those of us who had embraced Islam early on had been inculcated with the correct understanding of Islam, with the firm and pure theology in which we were resilient to the propaganda from extremists in that occasion. The extremist phenomenon is not new. And Brixton was one of the first, amongst the first, to refute the extreme and very dangerous ideology of these individuals I've just mentioned. And so, to give you a picture of how that looked, first and foremost, mosques like Brixton were few, as I've mentioned, and not often targeted, because many of them were very culturally led. Pakistani, Bangladeshi, North African Arab communities, African West African communities. So Brixton stood out like a sore thumb because of the gravitation of young individuals, young converts who had that street background and culture like myself. Here are the individuals, looking at the top left, Abu Qatada, and then Abu Hamza al-Misri, Abdullah al-Faisal, the Jamaican individual in the left corner, and Omar Bakri. And speaking concerning these individuals, I really want to give examples for the participants to understand what we were facing. Now, Abu Qatada, when he landed in the UK in the early 90s, I remember him visiting Brixton almost immediately. It was in the evening. And he came with Abdullah al-Faisal. Now, we had a guest speaker with us at the time. And he met the guest speaker. We sat in a quiet room, and Abu Qatada started speaking. And I could see the excitement in Abdullah al-Faisal's eyes and the other individuals, Algerian, Moroccans, Arabs, who had accompanied him. And I saw the alarm in the face of our guest speaker, Dr. Amina Bilal Phillips. And we were waiting, as would happen, the conversation would take place, then there'd be a translation. More of the conversation in Arabic than the translation. This didn't take place at all. Abu Amina would not translate. So then when Abu Qatada went, and he's an entourage, if you like, we were quite frustrated. It's like, what was being said? And he said, I will not translate what this man has said. He is dangerous. He should not step foot in this mosque again. I'm very worried about the presence of this individual. And he basically espoused his agenda, his beliefs. And this is what alarmed Abdullah al-Faisal. Abu Hamza, we know about his rhetoric, about his encouraging of individuals to fight, sending even his family, his half-son or stepson to Yemen, and what had taken place with kidnappings and things there, for which he was eventually extradited to the US and is now incarcerated for life imprisonment. Abdullah al-Faisal, I knew him personally when he first came to the UK. The elders of our community introduced him, and they were an African Caribbean individual who could teach the religion, unsuspecting about his real ideology. And we were questioning because we didn't know him. We wanted to know, was he Salafi? Who was he? We were young Muslims at the time as well. He confirmed that he had the similar beliefs to us. But very shortly afterwards, we saw his views became very, very radical and extreme, to the extent that we stopped having study circles with him when he threatened to overthrow the Brixton community and inflict violence, which wasn't the way, as we see on a more macro level, with the Khariji extremist belief in overthrowing governments and labeling the regimes as non-Muslim. Faisal was, for us, being an African Caribbean individual, one of the most dangerous for our community, because he lulled a lot of them with his charisma, with his distorted ideology, with his understanding of the social and societal context that many of us had emanated from, in order to lure them and give a warped understanding concerning these individuals. Omar Bakri, we know, was the part of Hizb ut-Tahrir at the time, and then he moved and started his own movement called Al-Muhajirun, Anjem Chowdhury being one of the foremost and ardent followers of him. He fled to Lebanon and was then prohibited and prevented from returning to the UK. These are two individuals now who became susceptible and followed the pathway of extremism, violent radicalization from the teachings of Abdullah al-Faisal, Abu Hamza, and Omar Bakri in this instance. The one in the center of the picture, Richard Reed, also known as the shoe bomber, Abdul Rahim as we knew him, and the one on the right being Zacchaeus Moussaoui, known as the 20th 9/11 bomber. The picture on the left there is that of Brixton Mosque, as you can see. I knew these two individuals. These two individuals I ended up prohibiting, banning from the mosque because of the extremist views that they started to espouse. Richard Reed, the shoe bomber, was more polite and amiable in his manners when dealing with me as the leader of the community. However, I was receiving reports of him arguing and having very vociferous discussions with individuals late into the night. And the last time I saw him, in which I showed him he wasn't welcome, I was walking through that very door that you can see on the left. And as you open it, you are met by stairs going up to the first floor. He was coming down in military pants and a khaki jacket. And he wouldn't look me in the face because he knew by this time that we were on totally opposite understandings regarding the religion. And I respectfully said that he wasn't welcome here. Zacchaeus Moussaoui was a totally different kettle of fish. He would come in arguing, raising his voice, challenging me about jihad and my understanding and the community's understanding of jihad, saying how can we disagree that there was no and say there was no jihad in the world. His friend Xavier went to Chechnya, and we saw pictures of him, his dead body, lifeless body on the back of a truck, having been killed in the fight in the second incursion into Chechnya at the particular time. So these individuals and the protagonists of extremism were very real for us. For many of you who are listening, some will feel this is abstract. Some will feel this is distant and remote. It does not come within your radar. This was what we were dealing with and continuing to deal with on a regular basis. And our messages and our sermons and our involvement and engagement with the young were very, very intensive, because we saw the destructive nature of extremism. Now, some may ask, well, could you not work in line with the police and notify them? You cannot police thought. And for individuals holding particular beliefs, these are not criminal offenses in that instance. So the engagement at that particular stage has got to be one that's very nuanced, and by those who actually know the reality religiously, as Anne has highlighted in the introduction, religiously and societally. Knowing the socio-religious context that we are engaging with these individuals with is very, very important. Someone coming from outside of that can cause more harm, can exacerbate the situation even more due to them not knowing these nuances. For society now, for statutory bodies, for agencies, identifying credible partners and confronting the challenges together is a very, very sensitive arena to be within. And as we've seen today, and I will talk about that as we move more into community focused and what that actually is, and community targeted and what that entails. The sensitivities between these two cannot be underlined, underscored enough, because getting that wrong has caused, arguably, and there's evidence there as well, further radicalization, marginalization of not only individuals, but communities. And I want to give an example of where some partnership work from an American perspective with me and the work I was doing was effective. And I will refer to a case that some may not know, but from the US perspective, you may actually be aware of. The case of Jihad Jamie, as she was known, Jamie Pauline Ramirez, who is on the left, and Jihad Jane on the right hand. These were two white American converts who had become enamored by the narrative of jihad as they understood it. And Jamie Pauline Ramirez, within 6 months, had traveled from the US, taking her young son to Ireland to meet Ali Damash, who had convinced her that he would marry her and that they would go on this romantic, idealistic journey throughout Europe to prepare for jihad. And the first jihad that he wanted to enact was to kill Lars Vilks, the European cartoonist, the Danish cartoonist, who had drawn a depiction of our Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. Now, did Jamie espouse those views? That is what we needed to determine. But shortly after entering Ireland and marrying this individual, she started keeping a journal. The authorities were watching her as well, and she was subsequently arrested and detained, as was her now husband, Ali Damash. I was contacted at that point because she was shortly thereafter released by the Garda, the Irish police, because they didn't have enough evidence. She just went over as a wife. That's not a criminal offense, but they held on and they detained her then husband. I was contacted by the first secretary of the US Embassy in London, an academic that's well known to Anne and myself, a colleague that we are very close to, and who understood nuances of Salafism and wrote some very engaging and beneficial pieces, some of which we understanding of Salafism. And that was Quinton Rutorovic. And he contacted me. And he got to know me in a similar way that Professor Anne did. And so he contacted me and said, look, Abdul Haq, we have a situation and I'm contacting you as an independent expert. I said, okay, what's the situation? And he explained what had happened with Jamie Pauline Ramirez. Jihad Jamie, as she was known. And he said the FBI have put her up in a hotel in Ireland, and we are worried that she's going to get in touch with extremists in Ireland. now that she's been separated from her husband who's been detained, and we want to extradite her husband. So I politely said to him, well, you know, I don't work with the authorities. You know, I'm not going to be working with you or in this capacity as an academic, yes, but I'm no way am I going to be working with the FBI or any authority in this regard. He said, you don't need to. If you can just let them know that you are going to contact her as an independent entity, and we will leave you free to do that, and you needn't contact us again. So on those conditions there, I want to highlight now, look at the discussion that had taken place. An understanding from the first secretary of the US Embassy, a very significant position, understanding an independent expert, an independent practitioner was required to engage at a very, very crucial stage. And I'm going to jump forward, fast forward to where we are now. Look at Professor Ann's role at the moment in going into Syria, in going into the camps. That's something which government and intelligence services cannot do. The autonomy and independence that Anne has. Draw that parallel at the moment with where I was in 2009 and where we are in 2020 in this instance. Parallels of independence, expertise on the ground, and the authorities realizing and recognizing that they cannot deal with this issue in the context of their position and in the context of societal considerations. So I contacted the FBI individual and said, I'm only contacting you on this occasion. Quinta Viktorovic, First Secretary, said to contact you. He provided me with Jamie's number. That was the last I heard of him. I said, I'm not calling you back. I'm not giving you any information. I've just got the number from you. Thank you very much. Goodbye. Contacting Jamie now was a challenge because I had to explain to her as I introduced myself that I'd got the number from the FBI, how I'd been contacted. So obviously she would be suspicious. And so she was asking me, are you a government agent? Why are you contacting me? And I explained the same context that I've given to you all now. She asked me a few questions. What's your belief on jihad? What's your belief about the rulers? What about this? So I was thinking, she's been inculcated by Ali Damash, and I had to correct her on a few things without losing her. And as I explained particular aspects of Aqidah, the ideology that we were upon, she started listening, and I could see it resonated with her. But then I did another thing that only grassroots practitioners can do. As you are aware, I'm in UAE now, as Anne had mentioned, and I've lived in Saudi Arabia, going backwards and forwards between the UK for 18 years. The call to prayer started. And knowing her as a convert, knowing the idealism that she had, I said, can I share something with you at the moment? She said, yes. I said, the call to prayer is going now. Have you ever heard that before live? She said, never. And she had a young 4-year-old son with her. So I opened my window and I put the phone out for the duration of the call to prayer. This was the first conversation I'd had with her. You should see, you couldn't see, but you should hear how calm she had become. And you could hear her, the softness in her voice. This is amazing. Now I had her confidence. She saw I was there to represent her interest. And I said that whatever we need to do, we will do. But it has to be in your interest and your benefit. And shortly after getting to know her and the regular conversations, and again, I hasten to add, these were phone calls, me ringing her on my own expense on the number she was provided with, not being funded by anyone, not seeking funding or any alliance from government entities to support what I was doing. This is what we do at grassroots. This is similar to the work that Anne is doing and has been doing for years in an independent entity. And I'm not speaking to say this. Anne doesn't know I'll be saying this, but I need to draw parallels so that you can understand the importance of grassroots partnership, the credibility of independent entities that have the expertise, not government agent and supported and directed agents in that instance, because they lack credibility. And some may say, but we'll talk about Prevent very shortly. Didn't your organization take Prevent? Didn't you remove that autonomy and independence? I'm going to come to that very shortly. So moving forward with Jamie Boylan Ramirez, I convinced her of the need to return to the US because I said extradition proceedings would be sought, and she had a desire to return to the US or the UK and Europe one day. And I told her, if you're extradited, you'll never be able to return to Europe again. So my advice is go of your own accord, knowing that you're going to face particular charges. She accepted that. I also had to advise her because by now she was wearing the Middle Eastern garb of the black abaya and the headscarf, the niqab, the face veil, and the gloves. And she hadn't left America like that. So I said, look, we as Orthodox Muslims don't see that as extreme. And this is where we talk about behavioral extremism, which is subjective, depending on societal context, and ideological extremism, that of the extremists, the violently radicalized individuals. So I perceived from my PhD studies and applying that practically, that she would be perceived as being extreme, returning to her home country. So I advised her, I said, Jamie, wear the hijab, wear a long garment, but don't return like that. The media will have a field day saying, look at this extremist, jihadi wife. Again, she accepted that advice. If you check the media sources at that time when she returned, you won't find much because there wasn't a story to write about. She was arrested, her child was taken from her, and then began the long process of preparation for trial. And I'm not going to stay much longer on that. I continued with my independent advice to her. She'd be writing to me from prison and I would be responding. However, if she asked her defense lawyer, there's an individual, his name is Dr. Abdulhaq Baker, he's been mentoring me, I'd like him to be involved in my case in some shape or form. Her lawyer, Jeremy Ibrahim, then contacted me. He said, I've seen your book, I've seen your publication and your studies. We don't have an expert like you in the US. Would you mind being an expert witness? I said, I have no objection to that at all. He applied to the court gave a court order, and the rest is history. I represented her in trial, giving expert evidence, and the judge remarked that because I'd highlighted that she wasn't extreme, she was this idealistic young lady who had a misunderstanding, a misrepresentation of the religion and had fallen into the arms, if you like, and had been ensnared by this very conniving and deceptive Ali Damash, who has since been extradited to the US and imprisoned. Moving on, look at Jamie and her idealism. And I mentioned to you just a short while ago that she started keeping a journal, a diary when she was there. I had access to her journal, I had access to everything that was on her computer and Ali Damash's computer. And she realized when she arrived there, what a mistake she had made. As we know, idealism is usually shattered when reality hits. And she went through that. She went through not being able to leave her home and go for walks in the park with her son because Ali Damash, her husband, was said he would take him. And we heard accounts of him taking the son on these apparatus that are in the parks, these child apparatus, and he would be tormenting the child in the snow, in the rain, biting him sometimes, pinching him because he wanted to make this young, now 5-year-old, into a young mujahid. She then made a video of the young son to please her husband, saying, who do you want to be? And he said, I want to be Salahuddin, who's an illustrious leader for the Muslims who fought the jihad against the Crusaders at the time. He was wearing a scarf on his head and an imitation sword, much like you would see young Americans wanting to be G.I. Joe. And there's no issue with being G.I. Joe. But within the context of how her environment, this was frowned upon, that she was allowing and actually part of radicalizing her young son, who she dragged away from his comfortable American environment. So moving forward with this, looking at her diary and seeing her depression, seeing patterns of behavior that when her husband was in the home, you would see, because we had the timings, you would see she was looking at extremist material and listening to nasheeds of jihad and everything because he was at home. And some might say, well, wasn't that her belief anyway? No, because you could see patterns of cartoons being downloaded, romantic movies being downloaded at particular times. And we established that was taking place when he was out. As soon as he came in, abruptly, you could see on the timeline, the movie would end, the child movie would end, she would delete the link, and you'd see a jihadi or so-called jihadi video that had been up. So when he would come in, he would be seeing this and he would become pleased with her. Now we will talk about community focused versus community targeted engagement. And what do we mean by that? When it's community focused, this entails partnership from a government level with civic society community levels. And both are partners in the such that there's a give and take regarding the remit within which both entities would work. And the community focused partnership is more of a facilitatory process from government, from the police, in that they're not getting involved, they're not seeking data and intelligence and for spying to be done amongst Muslim communities. Whereas community targeted engagement is that age-old, top-down, hierarchical, seeking informants to provide information and spying on one's own community. And this was something that my organization and others who decided to engage in the initial stage of Prevent spoke very, very emphatically about before even considering working in partnership with government and associated organizations. And I remember the government approached me because they'd heard about the street program and they'd seen the success of what we were doing at grassroots, the self-referrals and the hundreds of individuals who were engaging with us each week. Now, when they presented the agreement that they wanted to enter with me, I highlighted, I'm not giving intelligence. I'm not sharing these details with you. You cannot direct us as to how you want us to work. We are going to continue with what we've been doing the past 10, 15 years, but we will do it within a more formal apparatus in which we will update you only to say what is happening with regards to activities, but we will not be giving you activities being our activities with our grassroots participants. However, if via one of the channels they had referred an individual to us who had been released from prison, who was in the channel program, then we would report back to them updates on how that individual, he or she, was doing so far as it related to engagement with them. Very generic in that particular instance on those occasions. So they were content with that. They wanted more, obviously. They wanted details about the hundreds that we were engaging with. We said, no, these are self-referrals and they are coming within a safe space within which they will engage, and where we see radicalization, where we hear extremist thoughts, we will de-radicalize, we will engage with, we will disengage via our deconstruct program. Much of what Anne is doing today with Molly and the disruption, obviously we weren't at the stage that they are, and it's very impressive to see what's being done on social media. So I was really pleased to hear that, and I want to congratulate Molly and Zach for doing that. That is deconstruct live, if you like. And we were doing that by looking at particular videos, particular footage that we were seeing being posted, knowing that these young men, young women were looking at them. And we would re-watch these videos in a private context and basically deconstruct every aspect of that narrative, giving the correct context, giving the correct understanding and interpretation in this instance. But what happened, unfortunately, with this approach, which was very successful, we won awards for innovation because of the approach that we actually had. We saw a change, especially when the Conservative government came in that they wanted to see a more targeted, hierarchical approach. Muslim communities were to become suspect communities, were to be looked at through a lens of suspicion. And therefore, what was required was only to identify credible individuals who could be informants and provide information and intelligence on their own communities. Therefore, becoming a community-targeted engagement. Unsurprisingly, street was one that could not abide by or adhere to such guidelines. And eventually, we lost funding, I would say, because of this reluctance, and also because then they started coining a new phase that those of us who practice orthodoxy, Salafi in this instance, were then seen and considered through a lens of non-violent extremism, accused of being precursors to extremism. And there's no evidence to date that highlights that that's actually the case. What happened as a result of this? You'll see liberal entities became involved. And I coined it and referred to that as liberal extremism. Liberalism took place, and we saw movements within the Muslim communities and without, if you like, rallying the government to say their perspectives on Islam were the correct ones, and that all else was to be damned and all else was to be suspected or doomed. And I don't mind mentioning entities in this instance. We saw the emergence of organizations like the Quilliam Foundation, who became a mouthpiece for the government. And they were they were the antithesis of Orthodox Islam. And they spoke with a narrative that placed the entire Muslim community under a spotlight of suspicion, even today. And we witnessed something. We witnessed from that targeted approach and these voices that were coming from within Muslim communities and speaking with a language that was that resonated with government, a pendulum swing from a societal liberalism, modernism, across to extremism. What we held to be the middle and balanced perspective, where we felt that we were, was completely overlooked. It's important to consider the following. Who are in touch with the youth at grassroots and work with them? Where are new practicing Muslims going and who do they relate to? Who comes from a similar sort of background, or indeed the type of background that youth try to emulate, who understands the call of these deviant groups? Who actually follows the religion based on sound orthodoxy and understanding, and are connected to the scholars who teach this orthodox and authentic understanding of the religion? And also, equally important, who have the practical solutions and understanding to address, engage, and tackle these youth who have been politicized in their very fundamental and foundational stages of Islam. Because when you're politicized at that stage, at that early stage, which I call the founding phase, the cognitive development theory that I developed, Quinton Wittrovic also has a cognitive development theory, which you can find in one of his excellent books of when he studied and wrote and expounded about Hizb ut-Tahrir at the time. But when you're at that foundational stage, as I mentioned at the introduction of this presentation, you're very susceptible, you're very vulnerable. So if you're taught a politicized understanding, as Richard Reed the Shoe Bomber was when he came out of prison, as Zacharias Moussaoui was when he came to the UK from France and had already been radicalized with that politicized understanding in France, then you are ripe for violent radicalization. However, if at that early stage, which is an abstract stage, you have abstract understandings, you do not have actualization of what you are learning or practice. If you are taught the very fundamentals of the religion, monotheism in its purest form, learning about the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, and the context with how he practiced and taught his followers, and then learning how to take that element and apply it in part or in total in your life in a Western context, then your trajectory is a lot more sound and a lot more safer, away from this politicized extreme understanding. Now, that's not to say that a politicized understanding in every instance is extreme, but it's through this prism of politicization that you can start bringing in emotive things. Look at what's happening to the Muslims today. Look at this crusade against the Muslims today. The only way to respond to this is force with force. They are bombing our countries. They are killing our women and our children. And because we can't go to those lands prior to ISIS, we must enact violence and terrorism in our own land. Now, the grievances that are being highlighted, Muslims across the world have those grievances. We don't like the heavy-handedness that has been seen across the Muslim world, and the scores and hundreds and thousands in instances of innocent Muslims who have died from Western responses to terrorism. We don't like the situation of our colleagues, our co-religionists, brothers, sisters, children, if you like, as Muslims would say, in Palestine. Most of the Muslim world holds these grievances, however, are not imbued with extremist ideology to move in the same way that this minority of violently radicalized individuals and their protagonists move. So these questions are very important when considering community-focused engagement. And those who are supportive of community-targeted engagement, you cannot consider these particular questions because they are of no consequence. They are inconsequential to you. You just want intelligence in order to move the security apparatus in the way that it does, in targeting and finding and surveilling suspects, of which become the entire Muslim community. The woman who decides she wants to wear niqab and the veil. Behavioral extremism in the context through which you are looking. So therefore you look at her as ideologically extreme. The individual who has returned from Hajj and has now decided to grow his beard. You consider that to be ideological extremism when in fact it's behavioral extremism from your context. And from the Muslim context, it's just an aspect of religiosity he or she has decided to espouse through their covering or through identifying themselves more as Muslim through their outward appearance. But if you are coming from a targeted perspective, you will never be able to discern between the ideological extremism, which is the one we must be looking for, and the subjective understanding of behavioral extremism according to a wider societal context. Continuing. Let me go back there. This particular image may alarm some. This is a reality. And I don't want to go into reading. It's there for you to read and look at yourselves. But this is a status symbol and a power symbol, and for some, a necessity due to the environment within which they live. And those who had a propensity for violence before converting to Islam, they are targeted by extremist protagonists. Why? Because they then say that propensity for violence that they had is a meritorious characteristic that they need to harness within Islam against the common enemy. The common enemy being who? All non-Muslims and Muslims who subscribe to a belief and methodology different to them, because you are now in a context of Dar al-Harb, a place of war. That's the context that is then given to these individuals once they've converted to Islam. And this particular weapon now becomes a status symbol and becomes a tool in which reward can be obtained religiously. Here I speak about briefly, to further what I've just mentioned, the gang, gun, and knife crime. And my research and my team's experience has shown that there is a correlation between gun crime, knife crime, gang culture, and when converting to Islam, the possibilities of violent radicalization. Because think about it. When you've got individuals who've been on the margins of society, who have only known life by trying to get an L plate, to be in prison in a safer environment, but then they adopt an ideology whereby everything they used to do as criminals now puts them within a framework of being heroes, now puts them within a context of martyrdom being achievable, in that whatever they have done in their previous life, as Anne had highlighted and intimated in her introduction, this individual who said, basically, my sins are so much that the only way I can be forgiven, according to the extremist narrative, is to go out as a martyr, a mujahid, killing the enemy, the perceived enemy. So this correlation is one where organizations at the grassroots, like mine, like Street and others, engage, as I said, in a very intense environment, knowing that these individuals, the Richard Reeds, the Zacchaeus Mousawis, have come in, and if they are enticed to that extremist narrative, that it will be destructive. The end result will be destructive, as we saw with Richard Reed trying to enact a bomb in his shoe on that transatlantic flight in December 2001. As we saw from Zacchaeus Moussaoui, who was aware of the imminent plans to attack the Twin Towers. And what did he do? Those who don't know the case, why did he come to the authorities' attention? He was in the US beforehand, and he was taking flying lessons, but his visa had expired. So he had been detained because of violation in this respect. But after 9/11, the authorities who were looking and combing data realized that this individual took flying lessons, and with one glaring and alarming aspect, he only wanted to learn how to take off. He was not interested in learning how to land. This is in the evidence. And it was from some wily, very perceptive agent saw this, questioned it, and realized he was supposed to be the 20th 9/11 bomber. And then we saw his court, his trial, and evidence that was given. He did not deny it. We saw the evidence of Khalid Masood, despite the fact that we know that some of that was forced testimony from what we know from the waterboarding and torture that took place with regards to him. But we saw correlation with the narratives and Zacchaeus Moussaoui, and then later Richard Reed, when he gave evidence that this plot was supposed to include Zacchaeus Moussaoui. As we move towards a conclusion, this image here I chose because in all of what we are discussing, many of these individuals have been marginalized or felt marginalized growing up, and there have been mental health issues that have been hidden, buried by them or society at large. So the stereotypes that are placed on young black men. When we see what's happening in America at the moment, what happened with George Floyd and the manner in which he was killed, and we can name many, Ahmed Arbery, jogging while black. And there were underlying issues that were there societally, but how did we know or determine whether there were also issues of marginalization, mental health, and the like with others? When we bring it within the context of belonging, when an individual converts to Islam, we are told we belong to a wider Muslim Ummah nation. And this is so attractive to those of us who may have come from broken families, those of us who have been marginalized and invisible within society, those of us who've had mental health issues, but have not identified them within ourselves and therefore not sought aid or help or assistance, or those of us who have identified it but have felt the stigma around mental health from our communities, from wider society, was such that we suppressed the mental health. But when becoming Muslim, none of that matters because it can be camouflaged. That mental health issue, the depression that you are suffering, you're told it's because you're of weak faith. You just need to do more in order to become stronger. You need to give more dedication. It's not treated from the extremist narrative. The marginalization, you're told that's from within because you have a natural disposition that you've never really left, and society is not for you because it's impure, it's decadent. So that marginalization, you should embrace it, because we are, after all, as Muslims, are a minority. And then authentic narrations are brought and misconstrued. Narrations such as, be like strangers in this world. The world is a prison for the believers. These are authentic narrations, for prophetic narrations, which the wider Muslim world embraces, but understands not to become extreme, but to understand the challenges that may be there in life, that may be there societally. And then this sense of belonging. There is nothing stronger than belonging to a transnational entity, faith group, movement. And when you are brought into that and told that this is a group that you belong to, you have brothers and sisters being tortured, but we have few soldiers to represent them. Look at the Muslims, look at the Malays, look at them following and being happy with the environments and contexts they live in. We need representatives, we need soldiers to revive the jihad. That sense of belonging for such individuals, marginalized, some with mental health issues, some at that very rudimentary stage of abstract understanding of their religion, then become ardent, violently radicalized individuals. Continuing. This is what mental health looks like for some individuals. Escape artist. Number of individuals who were formerly on drugs and coming into the religion, they move away from it because of this euphoria. And it's not just with Islam. It's just not with the Muslim faith. It happens with Christians. It happens with Buddhists. It happens with many. When they've converted to a religion, there is this zest, there is this zeal, there is this overzealousness. So you're able to move away from those habits, those addictions that are there. But occasionally, we take on another type of psychological addiction. We become so overly fervent in that faith. And those who don't detect it, co-religionists, see that this is just a very religious individual. This is a very religious young woman, very religious young man, not understanding or unpacking whilst getting to know them that they're doing this so they don't return back to that former addiction. This psychological addiction, this fervency now is the escape from that addiction that they had beforehand. And this is something that extremists play upon and prey upon as well, where they will say, in order to keep away from that, the ultimate is to sacrifice your life in this way. How does that appeal to an individual who is afraid of returning to their heroin addiction, to whatever addiction it was that preceded them embracing the faith? And the fear that they have, those who have been addicted to drugs, alcohol, or the like, know how frightening it is once you've given it up to return to it. And so the ultimate escapism is to sacrifice yourself and get the ultimate reward. From one ultimatum to another. All of it extreme. This societal framework that I've highlighted now, you'll see that it was from my PhD, a convert community perspective, countering terrorism in the UK, a convert community perspective. And it's a cross-section of a funnel theory which I had developed, whereas the wider host society, outer rings as you can see, the mainstream Muslim community slightly within that, and then those who are closest to the problem, as Anne highlighted, I have to refer back to what she said in the beginning, those closest to the problem are the Salafi communities. They are close to the neck of the funnel, where the vacuumous pull becomes more intense, and where they engage with those who are spiraling down that funnel towards extremism, that very strong gravitation towards extremism. And often the Salafi communities are able to stop them at that particular point, and in some instances, once some have gone down, cause a reflux back up, because the individuals have realized the theology of the Salafis. They've realized the contextualization of how to practice Islam within Western society is more accurate, is more actualized than the abstract idealism of extremism. Now you are looking at the reality that is there on the ground for many. whereas you see the gun-holding individual on the left and the religiously astute one holding the religious book, the Quran, or other religious books on the right-hand side. This dualism is a reality. This dualism is what extremists seek, because they can see that one holding the gun on the left will become an ardent worshipper. But again, I have to highlight, if the politicized, emotive understanding is introduced at that stage on the right-hand side, then we are faced with a very, very risky situation and environment for such individuals. And that's why the grassroots community focus context is so, so important, because we know this stage. We can identify this stage, and we know how to intervene at this stage and steer such individuals in the correct direction. And I will conclude. One of the worst things we can have, and we have seen, we had gang culture, as I mentioned. We saw the emergence of a gang in South London called the Muslim Boys. What were some of the things that they would do? They would go around forcing conversions on particular individuals. And in the most extreme case, one convert, who I knew personally after he became a Muslim, his own brother in Brixton was shot 5 times in the head at point blank range by extreme Muslims because his brother would not convert to Islam. We had individuals running into the mosque saying they wanted to become Muslims. And we had to establish, why are they so agitated? And on some occasions, as was reported to me by some of my colleagues when I was chairman of Brixton Mosque, on the high road were some Muslims with extreme understandings saying if they came out of the mosque as non-Muslims, they would kill them. This is what the ideology does when it is distorted, when it is warped, when it goes unchecked, when there's an absence of a counter-narrative, when there's an absence of communities, community leaders, practitioners who are proactively not only countering this narrative, but teaching the correct one. And what has happened with the community targeted approach of the UK government, for example, is that these Salafi communities, and I mentioned this in my PhD and I refer to it in other papers that I've written, have now become insular once again. They've reverted to this insularity because of the fear that they were going to be labeled as extremists because of their orthodoxy, because of their physical appearance, which was then taken to be behaviorally extreme and also ideologically extreme. So this absence of such authentic voices in countering and combating extremism has been replaced by government-supported narratives. And again, I'll speak to that point. Well, didn't you obtain funding? Yes, on a community-focused basis, and within that remit, which was negotiated from the grassroots in favor of our communities, and the government negotiated within its parameters that it was able to work. And it was a tense sort of relationship, but an effective one, because their concerns of radicalization taking place amongst vulnerable communities was allayed, and the community's concerns were addressed in that there was a conduit in our organization engaging with them and keeping government at bay, and government didn't have to come into our communities because of this conduit representing in a facilitatory manner the empowerment and support of these young individuals. And that's what is very, very important in a community focused context, that entity acts as a conduit, a bridge between these two disparate entities that view each other either from a perspective of suspicion on either side, violence and marginalization on the community context, state violence from a government perspective. And this conduit, this bridge, can articulate the language to each of the entities, understanding both of them. This is why a community-focused approach and partnership is what should be reverted to, as opposed to what we're seeing today and the results of that. The recent London Bridge attack last year, in which innocent individuals were killed after this young man, Usman Khan, was released from prison, had said he was a reformed individual. They had thought through their apparatus and their strategies that he'd been de-radicalized, when in fact he hadn't been de-radicalized at all. He had been disengaged. And disengagement takes place, as John Horgan articulates in his seminal work. Disengagement takes place because context, circumstances, environmental or otherwise, have changed. But the belief system that has prevailed beforehand continues to do so once the individual's circumstances have been changed. And at the first opportunity, they will enact that extreme belief. Like we then saw in Streatham a few months later, earlier this year. Individual released from prison, they thought he'd been de-radicalized. Yet again, he'd been disengaged. And at the first opportunity, he tried to attack, maim and kill, and was shot dead on Streatham High Road. Outside, coincidentally, my first job as a young teenager, Boots the pharmacy, shot dead right there. So again, that had some, a very poignant effect and moment for me, seeing how close it is to our environment. And that's why we are the ones best placed in dealing with this issue of violent radicalization among the grassroots. And I will end there. Thank you for your time.
The slides, thank you. That was a fantastic talk, getting lots of messages of how great it was. We're short on time, so I'm gonna start calling on people. Lisa, you had a question and I thought it was a great question, and I'll also add to it. I met Abu Qatada in Jordan, I think 3 times, and I can definitely say his Palestinian upbringing was the fire in his belly. But Lisa wanted to ask, at least go ahead, ask your question. I think
I appreciate both your work. You guys have done some outstanding research and work in this area. One of the questions I had was from the beginning, when you spoke about you met these people in your mosque, you saw them, and of course, you know, your translator wouldn't translate what they were saying. What was the tipping point for radicalization? Did they arrive radicalized? Was there a traumatic event that occurred? What was, if there was a singular event that led to the radicalization, what was it?
That's a very good question. And when you look at cycle of violence models, so for example, when you look at the 7/7 bombers, there was a tipping point, as you mentioned. So many, for the 7/7, some of them looked at the protests that preceded the 2003 incursion into Iraq, the second Gulf War, if you like. And they saw that the democratic process didn't work. We saw the largest galvanization of protests across the world prior to the 20th of March 2003, when the US and allied forces went into Iraq. So they saw a failure of the democratic process in that instance, on that particular occasion. But their beliefs were were being fomented anyway, looking at what was taking place globally. It was just that tipping point. For Richard Reid, for example, remember we had 9/11. The world changed after that particular point. He had actually disappeared beforehand, and his mother had come to visit the mosque and contacted me. His mother was white British, non-Muslim, and she said, I know that he'd gone to Pakistan, so did we, and friends had been in touch with him. But she came to me around, I think it was around July, saying, we haven't heard anything from him. He's not writing. Have any of you heard anything? I said, well, no, since I'd asked him to leave the mosque, I was unaware, but I said I'd asked some of my colleagues and some of the co-religionists. They didn't know. The tipping point for Richard Reid is after 9/11, We then saw the attack on Afghanistan. That was the tipping point for an individual like him. That a country was targeted in this particular way. So there are various tipping points for individuals. And as I've said, that cycle of violence model, there's a spark where they say enough is enough. Now, Abu Qatada came radicalized. He was very much radicalized, and he was a leader of radicalization when he came. There's absolutely no doubt about that. Abu Hamza, similarly. Omar Bakri, similarly. Abdullah al-Faisal, I believe he had the extreme beliefs when we knew him, but he was suppressing them. But then he started watching things happening, bombings that were taking place in Saudi Arabia, Riyadh, and he started espousing what we would call is the Khariji view, because he hated the rulership and the governments and leadership in these Muslim countries. So there are always particular tipping points, and that actually, I would say, act as a catalyst for existing underlying currents of extremism.
Thank you for that. And we have a whole bunch of questions, and I'm just going to also jump in on that and say this underlines that it's not all ideological. But when you combine the two, I mean, did you hear that in everything that Abdul Haq said? You know, people watching world politics and watching injustice, and people starting out their lives in injustice because they live in poor neighborhoods, or the color of their skin, or how they choose to dress religiously, facing injustice. So these are political and societal things that have nothing to do with religion. But in the case of militant jihadists, they manipulate it. But we have another wonderful question from DT from Indonesia. We've just started working with DT, and she's doing great work. So DT, take the mic, please, and ask your question.
Hello, good evening and good morning there. Because
good morning.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Abdul Haq, for your great presentations. And I'm really, amazed with your work. But I really want to learn from you, because what I heard from your presentation and what my experience meeting the we call it terrorist inmates in the prison, or the ISIS supporter. I'm thinking then, when I'm also listening from the other experience from different countries, I think the narrative they use is almost the same. So I'm listening the same tone from ISIS supporter from different countries. So I'm thinking, so maybe ISIS using one, they using they have their propaganda machine, and then it is digested easily by the people who are actually very weak in religions. Yeah, I mean their religion is, their understanding on Islam is really poor, so they can digest it easily. But the problem is, in my opinion, because I just met a woman inmates last Monday, the problem is what we thought that they are wrong in their opinion, we are actually the one who wrong. They are the one who right. So I was thinking, okay, so we tried to convince her, we tried to argue with her, but in their opinion, we are the one who wrong, and we are the one who Togut actually, because we are having different ideology. Togut is infidel, yeah, so they consider us as infidel because we have different ideology with them. So what kind of method? I mean, because I think what I have heard from you before, that the narrative is Islam is being, oppressed, the Muslim, the Sunni Muslim was being killed by Shia. So this kind of narrative are oftenly I heard, yeah, from them. So how do you deal with this? I mean, when you do the radicalization or disengagement or the construction, like you have said, how do you, what kind of method do you use? Because I need to learn from you, because I also do I'm also working the same thing like you do, but not yet in the community level. But so how do you do it, and whether this approach is actually effective or not? Because changing them, because they also have they have a roles, meaning that they can do the taqiyah. Taqiyah means in front of you, they might say good things, but behind you, they can do the other things. So this is what I experience here, yeah, there are many people said, yeah, we are already repentance, but then they're doing the jihad again. So this thing, how do you do? How do you try to deconstruct their radical thoughts and how effective it is? So that's what I want to learn from you, Abdul Haq.
Very good question, and I can answer that in quite in brief actually. The last part that you're speaking about, taqiyya, as you said, the deception. This is clearly highlighting that they're disengaged, but they're not de-radicalized whatsoever. And some of them will do that to give the impression so that they can be released from incarceration, basically to get out and do what they want to do, as I've highlighted already. When looking at the arguments concerning these individuals, we as Muslims have history and the context of history on our side. And when we look at the very first early dissenters, the very first extremists, and we see how the first companions of Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, addressed them, when they brought arguments from the Quran, and the companions and the leaders, for example, then brought the context of those arguments and brought the counter narrative to those arguments. Like, for example, we saw one of the extremists they said, why did you fight against Ali radiallahu an? And they were basically saying, because one of the things were they won the battle against the other fellow companions and they didn't take spoils of war. The counter argument was that, well, Aisha, one of the wives of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, was on the army of the other side. And God not to marry any of the wives of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, after he is gone. This would be a major sin, and worse than that, to take them as concubines or slaves. Now, these kinds of arguments that came about, and there was a series of discussions that came about, and it became abhorrent. Some of those opponents saw that, well, actually, yes, the Quran says this. So if we are to go with our trajectory and line of thought, it means abusing and transgressing a major injunction of the religion. And that's what needs to happen. When you bring history and you bring it to the present context, this is when you'll see them not having a counter narrative with you. Some will remain silent because they're unaware of history and they're unaware of the parallels that are drawn today, because the extremists don't do that. They will not give that narrative because they know that that narrative and that historical precept contradicts everything that they stand for. So that's very important. The ideological aspect needs to be brought, and then it needs to be brought within the societal context that they are living in.
That's great. Thank you for that. And I'm sure that you could speak for hours on how to actually do that. And maybe we'll have to set something like that up sometime, because people like DT are struggling with exactly how to do it. And it is so important. And I've always been an advocate that we need to de-radicalize, not only disengage. We have a question from Richard Gadzekpo. Would you like to ask your question, Richard? Well,
hello. Sorry, it's Ricard. It's Ricard. Salaam alaikum.
Oh, Ricard. I'm sorry. Yeah, I need better glasses. Sorry.
No, that's fine. You'd mentioned the prevent strategy. Sorry, I wasn't throughout the lecture. I had to get up for a while. But I was wondering, what are your insights to the prevent strategy? So when it comes to community targeted investigation and its mesh with the education system. We see in a lot of countries now, particularly in the West, the education systems trying to undermine the ideology of core Salafism with certain doctrines in a means to homogenize the youth. I was wondering what your stance was on that, in terms of as an effective means to eradicate the threat of terrorism.
Very good question. Wa alaikum salam to you, Ricard. I think that this has exacerbated the problem. Prevent strategy as it stands now and has stood, as they call it, Mark II, from 2011 onwards, has become so toxic that what you've seen is that targeting of entire communities, and that has now entered education. not only at the most rudimentary primary school level, but right up to universities and colleges, where you've got instructions and guidelines of educators, lecturers, teachers, even in the medical field, in hospitals, to look out for particular signs of extremism. And despite their reluctance, we're seeing so many mistakes being made, catastrophic mistakes. And if you remember, I gave that depiction of the pendulum swinging from liberalism to extremism. If anything's going to cause that, it's the particular approach of the prevent strategy now, and how it's not only targeting, but criminalizing large swathes of Muslim communities. And again, it's toxic, it's destructive, and I believe it needs to be dismantled.
Thank you for that. Earlier today, Jesse Morton and I are starting to work together, and ICSV is working with Jesse, and he's on. I don't know if he wants to say anything, but he did say that back in the day when he was on the other side of things, he knew that you were Faisal's nemesis, and I was very proud of you, what you did. And I don't know if you want to jump in, Jesse, and say anything, or if you're working on other things and just have your computer on the side. Did you want to jump in? No, he's working on something. Okay.
Sure, I will be very brief because I know there's a lot of questions. First of all, Abdul Haq, assalamu alaikum. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Wa alaikum salam.
Nice to hear from you. I think it's very interesting. What you say is absolutely crucial. There has always been, since my transformation, an awareness that the people that are responsible for combating and countering violent jihadist ideology are unaware that the traditional Salafist perspective offers. And I think it's a very key point, because there's all kinds of reluctance. And one of the fundamentally flawed notions of engagement in this space, and an inability to distinguish between disengagement and de-radicalization, is that ideology, while it might not be the sole factor that is part of the radicalization process, is the gateway to establishing the rapport, dissecting the ideas that a person believes they've arrived at rational through a rational means, and then addressing the underlying causalities that might be political, that might be personal, that might be trauma based. And so it's one of the ways that we need to move the field forward, is to look at the nexus between personal factors, interpersonal factors, trauma, that cognitive opening that Wiktorowicz talks about, and how ideology provides that identity and that meaning. The only way that we're really going to be able to do that, and I think you're absolutely correct here, is take what we know from epistemologically and ontologically, in a basis where we're not coming at people assuming that they're ignorant about Islam, that we're coming at them addressing the Islamic narrative and how it the identity in a way that can pick apart the ideology, but also get a person to internalize I think so much of what you said is crucial. It's very along the lines of the conclude like to possible, as we are now working, Anne and I, particularly in the Maldives, looking at the West Balkans and trying to work with the foreign terrorist fighters and family members that are returning home. I think your paradigm and your framework is really compatible to what we're doing in the United States. And I was really, really impressed by your performance in your presentation today. So, just an endorsement. Thank you.
Thank you, Jazakallah khair, for such kind words, and your summary. I think I can't even add to it. It's on point, I would say. Thank you.
Very enlightening.
So we try to end on time every time, Abdul Haq, and I would just say, yesterday I was in a conference, and sorry I didn't have time to put up the link, but I'll add it to the chat when we send it around. I spoke on a thought experiment that we did, because I've always felt from talking to so many terrorists that this whole extremist view also, all the things that you said, that they cater to mental health issues, but they also sell this euphoria for suicide terrorism. because we know that people go into an altered mental state, a dissociative state, when they commit suicide, even in a normal suicide. And that if you get that euphoric sense as you're about to cross over your self-preservation instincts, and you're told that that's religious, when it's really just your brain turning on overriding self-defense. But if you're told that's religious, you can believe, yeah, I'm about to step into paradise. Right. And it's so frightening that terrorist groups have learned how to manipulate the religion, manipulate psychology, treat drug addiction, and on and on. And you were so articulate today, and I am so proud to call you a friend of many years, and I hope many more future years, and love to call you a partner in this work. And anyway, thank you for speaking with us. And if there's any last thing you want to say, please say it.
No, you're welcome. I want to thank you and all those who've participated, because I feel that even the questions, and if there's some way that all these questions you and I could share, and with Molly, and I can respond and you can respond, so that they're not wasted. I'll be looking at the conversation, then please facilitate that, and maybe on your website or something we can answer those questions.
Well, we'll send you the chat. We always go through the chat and put our answers, and so we'll send it to you, and you can put yours too. That's fantastic. We never like to bother our speakers too much, but if you're volunteering, we'll bother you. And,
no, absolutely.
Okay, thank you to everyone that took part, and we pride ourselves on starting on time and ending on time. So even though we probably could all listen to Abdul Haq Baker for hours, thank you, and God bless you. I hope you have a good evening, and thank you for everything.